Hey guys, welcome back. Joe here again, and today we are going to be demystifying the secrets behind improving your flexibility. And this is a simplistic explanation as to how you can improve your flexibility today. Now, before I get into it, I just wanted to put a quick disclaimer out there. I am not a medical practitioner. I don't have any qualifications with regards to um, things like health and fitness. I'm not a qualified fitness trainer. So it is important to note that these are only things that work for me, my understanding of these kind of topics. And if you are having any difficulties or you want further advice, please do and go and get that advice from someone who is trained in the field, who can provide more detailed and more qualified advice than myself. So that being said, and as I said, just remembering that this is my own experience with this, I want to tell you some of the things that have worked for me and some of my own understanding around this topic. So the first thing I actually want to do before we really dive into some of my tips and tricks for improving flexibility is I actually want to clear up some of the terminology that is often used around flexibility. Sometimes we hear flexibility, mobility, range of motion, and ultimately we don't necessarily know what all of these different terms means. So I'm just going to start by breaking that down. Now, the very first term that I want to break down is actually range of motion. Now, range of motion, sometimes referred to as ROM, is very, very simply the ability of a joint to move through a certain angle. And that is all range of motion is. Now, for some people, their range of motion is very, very limited, whether that's through injury or if they have a particular condition that limits their range of motion in their joints. And for some people, it can go a lot further. So then you start to hear the terms like hypermobility, and I'll explain what mobility is in a second. But hypermobility is where the range of motion, so say, for example, this is our knee joint here, and normally it bends round this way. But hypermobility is where actually we can go to a straight position, and then we can actually push slightly past straight position. And some people have again issues, conditions, and things like that around their joints and their ligaments, which allows them to have hypermobility and extend their range of motion into what is not necessarily considered a typical range of motion. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with having different range of motions, and ultimately, different people, different bodies will have different capabilities on this. And the important thing is that whenever you're doing any form of exercise or any form of stretching or anything like that, is that you work within your comfortable range of motion and you don't just try and push through it or push yourself too far, because that is how injuries occur. So the next term that I then want to kind of delve into is then this term of flexibility. So what is it we mean by flexibility? Now, all flexibility is essentially the passive lengthening of our muscles and soft tissue. So if we were doing, say, a hamstring stretch and you can't get very far, that's because actually your hamstrings are shorter. So what we're trying to do through improving flexibility is we're actually trying to just lengthen those muscles over time. And what's very, very interesting is that by holding a lengthened position of muscles actually will start to grow and start to lengthen as we hold that position. So if the muscle is in a shortened position for a long period of time, and unfortunately when we spend day to day doing things like sitting down at a desk or watching TV for prolonged periods of time, when the muscle stays in that shortened position, we can have the opposite effect. The muscle doesn't need to be as long, so therefore the muscle starts to get shorter and shorter. This is why a lot of the time people do tend to have issues, especially around their hips and their lower back, with things like flexibility, because they are sat in that shortened position and those muscles are shortened, which means that they do tend to start to shrink down over time. So then what is mobility? Well, mobility is the active controlled movement around a joint through that joint's range of motion, often requiring strength and neuromuscular coordination. Now, I'm not too worried about exactly what neuromuscular coordination is. However, all that's really saying then is that we are controlling a movement through a range of motion. And often people that have better mobility have better control moving through those sorts of motions. So if I was to do a squat and I squat right down to the floor, you can see that I have very good mobility within my ankles and around my hips to allow me to get right down to that deep squat position. And I also have the strength and control and coordination in those muscles to be able to do that in a safe and, as I said, coordinated manner. So it's very important that when we consider these different aspects, when people talk about flexibility or people talk about mobility, yes, they are all interlinked, because in order to be able to have good mobility, you also need good flexibility as well. And obviously, in some areas, you also need good range of motion, and they all interplay with each other. Improving one will also tend to improve the other. What's also important to note at this point as well, and one of the many things that people tend to fall into, is that whilst we're doing flexibility, it's also important to maintain strength of that muscle. So if we are lengthening that muscle, we also need that muscle to be strong in a lengthened position as well. So sometimes, and I've heard, very rarely, but I have heard stories of people that do a lot of flexibility training and they get very, very flexible muscle and they really lengthen their muscles out. But then because they then not develop the strength around that flexibility, then they then start to develop issues such as things like hypermobility, where we then are pushing into kind of overextending around joints, or they then have issues of weakness in other areas caused by the fact that all they're doing is just stretching and stretching and stretching that muscle to the point where the muscle is actually, yes, it might be very elongated, but actually there's a lot of weakness there. The idea of strengthening is also important as well, because it also helps us to have flexibility, but also protect our muscle, protect our bodies at the same time. So, for example, if I have a lot of flexibility, say in my hamstrings, and when I'm say playing tennis and I run for a ball, I'm in a bit more of a lunge position. If I don't have the strength as well in that hamstring, I might be able to get into a really good kind of stretch position to be able to get that ball. But if it's then really stretched, I don't have the strength to protect the muscle as well. All that's going to happen then is that muscle is then just going to start to get injured because it doesn't have the strength to withstand the forces going through it whilst also in that lengthened position. So it is very important that we don't just focus on flexibility, we also focus on how to maybe strengthen those muscles a little bit as well. So now for the next part of this video, I want you guys to come and join me, and we're going to go and try some stuff. I'm going to go through into my other room where I've got my little gym set up. I'm going to get set up there, and I want you guys to join along, and I want you to have a go at some of these techniques that work for me, that should help or have helped me at least in the past with my flexibility. So welcome to my gym room. It looks very bland this side, but I promise you there is some other gym equipment behind you over there. But I wanted to clear this space because, as I said, today we're going to be looking at how to improve flexibility through some of the things that I have found really help me. Now, just a little note at this point as well, because I have actually been a little bit unwell for the last couple of weeks. My flexibility at the moment isn't as good as maybe it can be, but that's not really a problem. And it can show you, hopefully, a little bit more effectively how some of these techniques can then start to help improve our flexibility. Now, the very, very first thing that I want to say, and the very first tip that I've got for you guys is making sure that we are relaxed when we're doing our flexibility training. Now, this might seem like a really super obvious thing to say, but the number of times that I see people, I'm going to do a lot of this doing hamstring stretches, but the number of times that I see people, they might get themselves to a really good hamstring stretch position like this, and they're like really forcing, they're like, I need to try and reach my toes as much as possible. They're really forcing themselves. They might be grabbing their foot and really pulling in and trying to pull their head down to their knee and overexerting themselves whilst doing this. Now, all that's really going to happen is that if you're holding this position, you're really, really tense whilst doing it, you cannot let your muscles effectively relax to effectively let them lengthen correctly. So it's really, really important that when we're doing flexibility and we're actually trying to push into that position of being more flexible and we're trying to lengthen that muscle out, is that we relax as much as possible. So then off the back of that, the second tip that I then have for you guys is, well, how to breathe correctly in order to allow us to relax. Now, some of you might already know this, but breathing is very, very important when it comes to helping us to relax and letting our bodies, letting our muscles kind of stop contracting so much and allowing us to kind of move into that flexible position so much. So we're going to try this now. I want you guys to follow along if you're able at this point to follow along. So we're going to get ourselves into a basic hamstring stretching position like this. You can do this with any kind of stretch as well, but I find that this is a really good example for helping to stretch the hamstrings. The hamstrings, for those of you that might not know, are just these muscles here at the back of your leg. Okay, so we're going to get ourselves into this hamstring stretch position here. And then what we're going to do is, instead of just going, okay, I'm going to force myself to reach as far as possible, we're not going to worry about breathing to start with. All I want you to do is just as far as you can go without really straining. I want you to reach as far forward as you can. So that might just be to your knee, it might be to your shin, or you might be able to get all the way to your toes. But I want you just to reach as far forward as you can. So I'm going to place my hands just around here, which is kind of in line with my shin. And then what I'm going to do from this position is I'm going to take a really deep breath in. But as I breathe in, I'm going to try not to bring myself up like this. I'm going to try and hold this position here. And as you breathe in, hopefully you should feel that it almost feels like you're breathing into that stretch. And what I mean by that is, when we're going to hold this position and we breathe in, it should almost feel like you can feel the muscle kind of starting to stretch a little bit. And then once we've done a really deep breath in and we've kind of lengthened everything out a little bit, we're then going to breathe out fully. We're going to go all the way out. We're going to let the body completely relax. And as we do that, we're going to let everything sink and feel really heavy into that stretch. And hopefully you should be able to see that you can then stretch a little bit further than you could before. So I'm going to try it. I'm going to get my hands in position. I'm going to take a really deep breath in. And then I'm going to breathe all the way out and just relax. And already you can see how much further down I can get. I'm even going to try now and start to grab my foot as I do this. I'm going to try one more. Breathe in. And then breathe all the way out. And you can see just by breathing, I've gone from my hands being here next to my shin to being able to get my hands around me and my feet. And I guess then the next question then is, well, you've kind of got this relaxation, you've got this breathing technique. How long do you need to hold the stretch for? And that's a really good question. And there's a lot of research out there which says, there's various times, but essentially you'll want to hold that muscle in an elongated position for enough time for the elongate for those changes, those physiological changes to start happening. Now, if you're a novice to this, I would always start on the shorter side. So really, you could even start with just 10 or 15 seconds, maybe just doing 1 or 2 breaths just like that, just to get used to doing this. If you've never stretched before, now as you then start getting better at that, those times can start to be pushed, up to 30 to 40 to 50 to 60 seconds. Normally, if I'm stretching, I stretch anywhere between 30 to 60 seconds, depending on the muscle that I'm stretching and depending on what I'm aiming to do. So you can do this using timer apps. You find I've got one where I can set a 30-second timer and then a 5-second break in between, which allows me just to change stretch position, so I can move from this position to this position in that 5 seconds, and then I can go into doing my next stretch. So that would be a good starting point. And again, pick a few stretches. And have a go at using this breathing relaxation technique to help you stretch more effectively. The other thing that I wanted to talk about very, very briefly is dynamic stretching. Now, what I've just shown you there is a very, very effective way to static stretch. And the difference between a static and a dynamic stretch is very simply that one you do whilst you're moving, so you're doing it dynamically and you kind of stretch the muscle as you're moving through a motion. So imagine if you're doing, say, like walking lunges, for example, that is a dynamic stretch. Whereas this here is what we say is a static stretch. I'm just going to hold this position for 30 seconds and I'm just going to let the muscles lengthen whilst I'm in this position. Now, both of them have their advantages and both of them have maybe some disadvantages. So the advantages of static stretching is that you can hold the muscle in that lengthened position for a prolonged period of time. So hopefully you'll improve your flexibility and the lengthening of that muscle faster. The disadvantage of static stretching is that it's not very functional. It also doesn't really help us develop strength within that muscle to be able to what I spoke about previously is this idea of being able to also strengthen the muscle to protect the muscle when it's in those kind of lengthened positions. So then the advantage of dynamic stretching is that then, well, we are also strengthening the muscle at the same time as stretching it, and it's more of a functional thing. So again, lunges are quite functional, especially if you play sport, being able to kind of lunge down at that low position and then being able to push yourself back up again, and the muscles being able to kind of stretch into that position and then come back again. However, the disadvantage of dynamic stretching is that, well, then you don't hold it in the length of position for as long. So there has to be a balance a little bit between the two. Now, I tend to do a combination of static and dynamic stretching, but I don't do them at the same time. So I tend to do my static stretching more in the evenings when I'm kind of relaxing and winding down for bed. Dynamic stretching I tend to do if I'm doing, say, a workout. And dynamic stretching is a really good way to warm up for any kind of workout. So I might do, things like kind of shoulder rotations. I might do things where I like rotate my wrists. I might do a few bodyweight lunges, a few bodyweight squats in order to just sort of get that body moving and also as well lengthen those muscles a little bit and allowing them to start strengthening by doing that dynamic stretching as well. So guys, there it is. There you have my tips for improving flexibility, some ideas that you can utilize when you're beginning out stretching, some ideas around, how to control your breathing, how long to be stretching for. Yeah, let me know how that goes. As I said right at the start of the video, please, please, please take care when doing anything like this, especially if you are new to it. If there is anything you are unsure about, please do speak to a professional. Either go and speak to a medical practitioner, go and speak to a physio, go and get advice from someone who's got a physical fitness qualification, and do get that advice if there is anything you are uncertain of before attempting any of this. I thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. If you have done, please do comment, like, and subscribe. If you have a go at these as well, please drop it in the comments and let me know what you think of the tips that I've given you. Let me know if there are any tips that you have tried yourself that you have found help you with your stretching and flexibility journeys. And thank you so much again. And until next time, I'll see you then. Bye bye.